Hi all, it's been a minute since we've last talked to you, dear listeners. This is Danny Wu, co-host of the show along with Elizabeth Mays for The Creative Voice, a creativity-focused podcast exploring what being a creative person is really like. Hear from local voices in their own words in the city of Detroit. I'm a freelance creative strategist, art director, and designer working locally in the city, and Elizabeth is a creative director and the owner of her own printing company, Maze Multimedia. And this series has been brought to you in partnership with the Detroit chapter of AIGA, a volunteer-based membership organization that advocates for creative professionals. You can follow us on social for more updates on events or upcoming workshops through our local chapter. We took a little bit of a break to reshuffle things in, the creative career because Elizabeth and I both have very busy lives. Our guest today is actually also like that as well. Steven Shik is would you consider yourself a fine artist at this point, or would you say like gallery exhibiting?
I usually just say fine illustrator and fine artist. I like using Illustrator. Well, my degree is actually fine arts and illustration, and my approach to fine art is still like illustrative and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm Steven Shik. I'm like an artist and illustrator and also an actual teacher now too. My background is in illustration, but I've definitely moved into more fine art in the last few years. A lot of my work has to do with like my cultural identity, or I should say like lack thereof.
How long have you been teaching, actually?
It'll be basically 2 years.
I've also taught at CCS before. It's an experience to teach at CCS because I think you get to see the next wave of graduates, but it's also interesting to see where they choose to explore their work and where it's going. I taught a portfolio class, so it wasn't a direct techniques painting class or things like that. So how did your interest in painting get started, given that you've been to both CCS and Kendall? So.
Well, I started painting back in college. I did it a little bit where I was mostly doing pen and ink, and then eventually I moved into oil painting. But then by the time I was like my last semester or last year at school, I moved away from oil painting for a lot of different reasons, and just moved back to just doing pen and ink and digital work. And it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years ago almost where the idea of painting starts sneaking its way back in. I think in some subconscious way, like just the idea of like digital and AI kind of like coming back, I almost feel like pushed me into like doing going back to painting a little bit. And it definitely wasn't because of that specifically, but I do look back and think about how much like AI has become such a huge thing in the last like few years, and how I also coincide with me starting to paint. Something I kind of moved back to because I kind of miss like getting my hands dirty again. I
really struggled for a couple years after I graduated in terms of making any personal work because my day job was spent in advertising. And even though it wasn't my work, when you're doing commercial art direction, you're still sketching things for people, you're still making comps in Photoshop, you're still storyboarding and pitching. It's still a creative process. It's just different because you're doing something that has a commercial medium. So it took me a while to really feel like I had any sort of ownership of what craft was. And I also felt the need to have like really final polished things because I think CCS drills into you that you have to have a certain finish to your work. Whereas nowadays, if anything, most of my stuff is a lot looser and I haven't really put anything online. Again, with the advent of the AI, I didn't want Meta to scrape it. Whether or not they scrape it from my website, well, So, totally understand the process. One thing I was going to add is we're going to get into some like past projects, and it dawned on me that you actually had your first solo show in 2019, and your next show is actually December 14th at Detroit Shipping Co. on Sunday from 2 to 6. How has your prep changed over the years? What have you noticed in terms of like theming or even just the technical stuff, right? This podcast is about how creative people manage their work, so...
Yeah, it's completely different from what I like back in 2018 to now. Well, for one, in 2018, I was still only doing digital work too. So I think that there's like a completely different nature to that. And that changes my whole process because in some ways my process has changed quite a bit, but it's also pretty similar because I still use digital work quite a bit for my preliminary stuff. That's another thing with process too, kind of skipping ahead. I've become such a process-esque person in terms of just sitting back and recognizing what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are. And I just noticed that I would get through halfway through like an illustration or something like that and then just be lost like halfway through because I hadn't figured out something. And I know other people and other artists that are more like kind of
into it. Yeah. They kind of like roll with it.
Yeah, and I am not that person at all.
I think that comes from draftsmanship. Going through a program like illustration, they really drill it into you that you have to have thumbnails and you have to have value studies and color studies, and whether or not you choose to use a lot of those.
I pretty much do all of those things, basically. Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why, even though I didn't go to CCS, I feel like the kind of thing they try to instill in their students is something I was already doing anyway.
Right.
Like that too. Even though I've only been teaching for 2 years now, I have a pretty big variety of classes I've taught. Where like I teach like a painting and figure drawing, but then I've taught junior studio and composition, which is like best of both worlds, where one's more technique-esque. I like junior studio specifically because I'm more of a, almost like an art director, basically.
Yeah, and you're exploring different things with people. They have a lot more flexibility in the thematic direction of their work when they're in studio.
That's like my favorite stuff to do. Getting them where they have a kernel of an idea and helping them like shape that and not necessarily like change it.
So what's your experience been like since teaching and doing group and solo shows as a Detroit area artist?
I think it's made me a better artist, specifically. Even go back to like what I was talking about with my process, where I think one of the reasons why I quit painting in college was because I just didn't really embrace the process that much, especially for oil painting, where I kind of hated how much it would take me, like almost like an hour just to set up, just to paint. When I started painting again, I engineered my process to be pretty much get rid of or change anything I don't like about painting. I saw some artists talk about how if you don't like something about your process, you should either just get rid of it or adjust it. So that was kind of my mindset. The way I paint, when I do these color studies, I pretty much pre-mix all my colors, like little containers and stuff like that too, so I don't have to like mix on the fly. Fast forward a couple years later, I'm asked to teach this painting class where it's like nothing but mixing in a palette. So where it's like the whole class is basically just stuff I've gotten rid of in my process. So like I was like, oh, I should probably learn how to do that if I'm going to teach it,
Yeah, but I still think it's important to understand that you don't have to follow what you've learned to a T if it doesn't work for you, right? Not only is it what your strengths are, but also efficiency in how you do things. Because I recognize that as well. I have a shorthand for how I want to get things done. And then some other aspects I'm still kind of noodling, but go back to mood boards. I go back to mind maps, which is basically just like a cluster of words that are associated with each other.
My version of that I heard another artist call it brain pukes. And so I always call it that, which I always think is funny. Like when I tell students that, for some reason, that's like the one thing that sticks to their mind, whatever. I'm like,
I think
all
it's
that information.
Just the word puke. We say different things in different industries. In advertising and in graphic design, more traditionally, a mind map is getting a cluster of ideas together that are tied to a central project or process. Speaking of projects, anything that you're really proud of that you've done in the past?
So if you kind of look at some of my work, I feel like there's like two distinctive like things going on with this show specifically, where one is more, all my work kind of has like a geometric quality to it, but there's definitely like a few pieces specifically that are going more towards like narrative work. That was actually kind of a byproduct of where I was teaching this composition class, where I spent this whole time showing work off some of my favorite artists and like how they tell stories and portray characters. And so that, I feel like that just kind of rubbed off on me a little bit, where I moved away from that a little bit, and teaching that class had made me want to go back to that. And comics are such a big part of one of my passionate things when it comes to art. I just really love comics in general. I think it's like the best medium. And so I kind of wanted to bring that narrative to core qualities to my work. I feel like it goes around and around too, where being a teacher made me a better artist. Also made me more confident, and like no student wants to go to expensive school and have a teacher go up and be like, I'm only good at this or that.
I may not be a specialist in their field, whether they're painting something in particular or their style. Some of the students I've taught in the past do a combination of illustration and design, which is really where I went into design and more animation. There are other folks who are like, hey, I do conceptual art or previs, and I can give them some advice that's more broad, but I also know that if you're going to talk to me about a very specific ink and brush technique, I would probably be able to dive deeper because that's something I do really well. But it doesn't mean that you can't be a good critic. I think teaching allows you to be more objective about art creation, and then it also allows you to provide feedback to creative people with more empathy than other industries. So that's something that I've realized over time is like, oh, okay, other people really don't have the vocabulary to articulate certain things that an artist needs to hear, and maybe they just don't fully understand what you're getting at. In the past interview for Planned Obsolescence, you mentioned that there's a flower that symbolizes resilience, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but muguhwa? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably better than the way I sounded. I mean,
but it's like an eternal blossom that never fades.
Yeah, the Rose of Sharon, it's part of
Rose of Sharon. Yeah. Symbolism for Korean identity is throughout your work, but how has that changed over time? Are there specific things that you shift focus into now than previously, or are there just new things in symbolism that you're finding?
Well, just even using it in general is like a shift. For the longest time, I had a really hard time even considering myself an Asian American or Korean for that matter. I was going to say this earlier too. I was only talking about technique about my solo show, but I wasn't directly talking about being an Asian American in that work now, and I'm doing that more directly. And there's a lot of different reasons why that's happened. Like moving to Detroit, for instance, was I think a big reason for embracing that, just being around more diverse people, not even necessarily around more Asian people than it was in Grand Rapids, but the symbolism behind the flower in terms of what it means is a big part of why I use it. But also I was just kind of struck by discovering that flower and even the look of it too. And with artists too, you kind of just resonate with certain things when you draw something where you ended up drawing something over and over again, just based off. And it can be something that's not even related to symbolism. It's just there's a shape design to it or that too. And when I discovered that flower too, it was kind of at that time where I was going to start making work about being more Asian American. And I think I was always worried a little bit in a weird way, where I just didn't feel like I was Asian enough, I guess, to be able to make work about that. And even thinking about that's really complex. So that's kind of what I wanted to start making my work about, where even those feelings in general. There's a lot of different moments over the last 5 or 6 years that's kind of culminated in me making work that's more directly about it. But in some ways I've always made work about that. Because I always talk about how I never talked about being Asian American or Korean in my previous work, but then I did work about identity and stuff like that too.
I think if you're an artist, you're going to be making work that's related to your identity, whether you're doing it consciously or not. And sometimes it might be certain types of relationships you have, or certain themes or subject matter that you really care about. I mean, you look at Andrew Wyeth and you realize he painted his neighbor and he painted his family, but he also painted this type of Americana that feels very isolated. The nature of someone like that, you're a studio painter, a landscape painter, and you also care more about the composition of where you grew up, which is rural. From an identity lens, you touched on whether or not you felt Asian enough. I feel like this has been harped on in many other podcasts and many other forms of media, but previous generations of folks were fighting for visibility or representation that was more palatable in a lot of ways. And there were always standouts in terms of art that were more disruptive, but you also have a culture that doesn't necessarily understand some of those nuances, especially if you're from the Midwest. You're not exposed to that much previously prior to college. In your case, since you're an adopted Asian American, it's a little different because you don't have a family connection to someone where you could ask some of those questions. So you're experiencing it through a different lens, more as an observer versus someone who's a participant all the time. The new show is titled The Tourist, and exploring Asian American identity, seeing the popularity of certain Korean trends in the U.S., how do you feel about being of Korean descent currently?
I mean, yeah, I think
that's a good question. Sometimes I feel like that question irks people, but I also would say, as an Asian American, I get that question a lot.
Yeah, I think The Tourist even kind of just shows how I feel about that. I mean, even this year too, it's been incredibly interesting how that's happened. Where when you're talking about being raised in the Midwest, I'm from Jackson, Michigan, which I don't know if anyone knows about that city. It's only an hour away from here, and it's mostly known for two things. It's either, I kind of joke where the other thing.
Yeah.
I always just thought don't pick up hitchhikers was a sign everywhere in the world. I didn't know that was specific to my city because of the prison. But also I guess there's a few different cities I can claim this. Jackson, Michigan has the best claim to say that the Republican Party was founded there. It was not the most supportive and most diverse environment. Yeah. I mean, that wasn't even a word I even knew existed, or things like diversity growing up.
I think when you are different in any way in a more niche space, you don't necessarily take up space as much. And it isn't until you have more independence as a creative person, but also as a person going into their like early 20s, that you realize, oh, I can assert some more independence. I can like be more myself, and that whole like coming of age thing comes into play as well. If you grew up here in the US and you didn't have that cultural connection immediately, your coming of age feels like it's in stages. So you don't necessarily think about your identity or being of a certain descent because it's a label that you either don't live up to or that you don't want to be a predetermined assumption of what you're like or what your work is like, because people will be like, oh, okay, you're Asian, so you're gonna probably make work about this or whatever, and I'm like, yes, I do make work about that, but I also have a voice that's still my own. We talk about, you know, representation not being a monolith. You know, the tourist is probably how, in some ways, is that how you feel, or is that how other people feel?
I think it's how I feel, honestly. And I don't know, maybe some people do feel that way about me, but I feel like I'm old enough now at the age, I just turned 40, and I mean, old enough now where, like I said, like a lot of those things weren't things, I didn't have the vocabulary or the way to talk about things like being diverse or even talk about mental health when I was really young, let alone when I was in my 20s and stuff like that too. And you know, when you grow up like in a place like I was describing, whatever, and stuff like that, where I'm kind of like basically mocked for either being Asian or the other pivot is like I'm not Asian enough. Like, so I'm either not Asian or I'm not Asian enough, or if like this like stereotypical way how like someone would actually just picture like an Asian person. So just to say, like, when you're like, you know, mocked and made fun of for that stuff, you tend not to, you know, double down on that and want to go learn more about that stuff. I mean, I kind of was talking about this just recently in one of my posts about how, like, people couldn't grasp the fact when I explained I'm adopted and not culturally Asian. They're like, well, why didn't you, like, go look up your parents or something like that, too? I don't blame them for thinking that, but it's also, like, I think they just don't really grasp, like, how Google...
It's not easy to do that. And especially if you are adopted, finding your birth parents can be a source of trauma or pain for people too. Like, I think if you wish to do it, it's different for everyone. When people were switching over from TikTok to RedNote, I noticed an influx of people on the RedNote app posting in English saying, I was adopted, I would like to know more about my birth parents, and if anybody in China can help me, please let me know. And the comments on those posts were somewhat helpful, but some of the comments were like, you don't want to know them, or you don't need to know them, or it's going to be more painful once you find out what actually happened. There is a loss that when you're younger you don't really articulate because, you know, you have parents and you're loved by people and you're cared for by people. But as you get older, it feels like there's a door in your mind that isn't open, but you also don't have the key to it.
Yeah.
So it's very frustrating because I think that when you're doing creative work, you also have things in your work in addition to the Rose of Sharon pieces that are related to metronomes or vultures. I was actually more curious about the vulture aspect.
Yeah, I think for me, I think a lot of those symbols too, like the vulture and metronome, like specifically were things that came from when I was in college. I was taking a photography class back in college, and it was mostly just for like
I thought it was musician. I was like, okay.
Yeah, that's the irony of the metronome thing. I'm actually I'm not a musician at all. So like I feel like, you know, like some of those symbols are more direct, like the Mongoa or the Rose of Sharon, or like the metronome, something more like, you know, the shape of it, like for my photography class. But then it just kind of started popping up more, and you know, and then over time, like it started like kind of developing more of like a shorthand what it means. And usually if you see a metronome pop in my work, I'm usually commenting on something in terms of like time, or I'm a very reflective person, so I'm talking about something in terms of like time, or even like this weird anxiety I kind of get whenever I would actually have it actually going, where it just kind of goes back and forth. And so there was usually some kind of like tension between like me stressing about time. Oh, the vulture specifically too. I just kind of used it because I thought it was like an interesting bird, but it wasn't until like I started doing more research about it in terms of the symbolism of it. Obviously, we think of vultures as a symbol of death, but I also found that other cultures it's like a symbol of rebirth, and so I thought the bird had a really interesting kind of like duality to it, where it's almost like this idea of like you could look at it, or I look at it as like almost like something has to end for something to begin. So usually I'm kind of playing around with something like that in terms of just
Yeah.
like endings leading to beginnings kind of thing whenever you see that pop up in my work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were quoted as saying, I have always been predisposed to obsession over time and the ways our culture measures its passing, anniversaries, seasons, years, etc. So, a sense of change, does it feel inevitable artistically? Does it give you momentum to do certain things now than it did before? Do you pause, or do you think that your art has seasons?
I feel like in some ways this show goes like different phases. I've kind of obsessed with thinking about terms of like anniversary or years and stuff like that too. This show specifically kind of took on a different meaning. I'm still exploring ideas of like identity, but it just happened to coincide with me turning 40, which has a lot of significance, or however not in terms of like age. And I'm not necessarily subscribed to that, but I'd also be lying if I said I didn't start thinking about like all your typical, specifically like male, like
My back hurts.
Yeah, my back hurts. Like, you know, like my hair is a lot more thin. Oh, weird. I've been thinking about death way more lately. Then
Aging and seeing people in your life change or go through a lot of significant moments. Like, I've seen people marry, I've seen people have kids, I've seen people divorce, but I've also seen people get into like their second coming of like being an artist, or finding out that they have completely changed professions, or they've decided to like explore a different medium or outlet for what they do. So I feel you there. I'm in my 30s, and I definitely am still trying to understand what I would want my art to be versus what my job is. Because I don't think having a day job is a bad thing for an artist if you are interested in having a very separate outlet that isn't personal. Because for some folks, if you're creative, you are really tied to creative all the time. I don't shut it off, and I would prefer to be independently contributing as a solo person. But then there are other folks who are a bit more collaborative, or they want to be creating their art in response to something or a reaction to something. And so they don't necessarily find ways to do that through a traditional day job, or they don't have the financial ability to be a full-time studio-driven fine artist, but they have this balance between I do this and then I also do this. And sometimes it's more about finding inspiration from whatever you're doing separate from your studio hours, where you're teaching or you're interacting with people, or like I love to people watch. So for me, I don't mind being in other spaces where I'm helping someone solve a problem and thinking creatively. And I also think that the subjective nature of art makes it so that you are definitely an advocate for yourself. If anything, even more so as you age into your career. So any aspirational dreams or things that you want to achieve in your artwork? Is there anything on a bucket list like you'd want to feature or be on some sort of big project, or what's your pipe dream situation?
That's been changing a little bit just because you kind of get to a point where, for me, I feel like I never had specific dreams, just like wanted to be an artist for a living, and you just kind of wake up one day like, oh, I'm kind of actually doing that. My life is just like so much that between this show and teaching now, and or even just like reading or sketching constantly, like it's kind of like almost nice to think about how much my daily life is all about art, but in a very healthy way where it doesn't feel like I'm just doing it just because. It's generally something, even if I wasn't doing shows or teaching, I'd still be doing art for sure. I was talking with a teacher about this, where he was talking about how sometimes you kind of sell yourself short a little bit, where you have these goals that are not, like they don't feel achievable, like being a teacher or having solo shows and stuff like that. Now those are things I have. So now I'm kind of in the middle of kind of thinking more about that. I want to keep having solo shows for sure. I would love to start like moving in like markets, like, you know, like I said, I was talking about, there's a couple of galleries I wanted to get in to here specifically as I navigate more, because it's a very different like mindset to be a fine artist and opposed to an illustrator. So I kind of start expanding my, you know, like the kind of shows I get into like beyond Detroit, you know, and thinking about like what markets I want to break into. But I also have this weird pull now where I kind of haven't really been trying to get illustration work, and now my work has shifted so much from doing more fine art stuff. So I want to take what I learned from doing more fine art stuff and applying that to more actual paid work and stuff like that. So I have like dream jobs, like I'd love to do, I don't know, something like for a Folio Society, you know, like which is, it's kind of like the Criterion of books, basically, if like people aren't familiar with that, or even a Criterion cover or something like that too. That's the kind of work I originally wanted to do when I was getting into illustration. Or I'd like to be involved in comics in some way, and I probably should just do my own comics at some point because it's been such an impact. But I'd love to be able to just like be a cover artist for a specific run or something like that too, or I don't know, in some way, because it's like
it's always alt covers or variant covers for
I would love to be able to do something like that. And I think that's kind of cool to think, even allowing myself to think like, oh, those are kind of achievable things for me.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in school, we had this class for portfolio prep where one of the projects was to reach out to a working illustrator or artist that you admire and send them like a little informal interview question sheet. And I actually still have mine from when I sent an email out to Ming Doyle when she was coming out as a comics-based artist. And it really came from her in her like his early 30s doing fan art and being discovered back when the algorithm wasn't so monetized. You could be discovered through the Explore page and also through Tumblr and Twitter when it was more active as a creative space. So she was doing like Star Trek fan art and some other stuff, and people were like, oh, you have a really cool graphic, inky style. We'd love for you to do some like variant things for different IPs that exist. And the same thing happened with, I think, Kevin Wada, I believe. He does watercolors. And they now do a lot of stuff in the MCU, actually. I think it really depends on where you think possibility is. But it sounds like you're very open to new things, because the things you wanted to do, you are doing.
Well, I think you sent me a video like sometime last month about Ashley Wood, who's like one of my favorite artists and stuff like that. And he actually kind of he operates kind of in this space where he's like a fine artist, but also is like heavily involved in like pop culture and comics and stuff like that too. And that's kind of something I've been thinking more about in terms of like trying to occupy a space like that, where he just had a solo show, and he's had solo shows in Australia and in Japan. So, but he also just did like a Batman cover, or he'll like write his own comics and stuff like that. He did stuff for Metal Gear Solid and stuff like that too, and that was one of my big things when I was thinking about that in college. It was like, oh, I would love to do that, but I couldn't even like fathom that that's something I can do. And now I feel like I'm in a position to be able to maybe like do something similar to that, where you know I'm still kind of figuring that out. But the reason why I went into illustration is because a lot of my favorite fine artists growing up, like I've noticed all of them were like illustrators, or they went to school for illustration and almost like graduated to doing fine art with that too. And I just thought about that more recently, because I kind of forgot that's why I got into illustration. So now I'm looking back to some of those artists, like, and how their careers had kind of shifted, you know, to occupy this more artistic fine art-esque world or illustration world. And that's like something I'm very interested in. And I feel like the barriers between fine art and illustration, especially in the last like 10 or 20 years, become less defined, and in a good way, I think. Right. You know, and so that's something I'm very interested in.
Yeah, it's blurred a lot now because of, honestly, I think social media has democratized people's exposure to art quite a bit. I think that pop culture fandom and working with creative IPs has been an avenue for artists to have the means to do their own work personally, or to take a different interpretation of an existing work. So you have people like James Jean. When I was in school, James Jean was one of the top artists that people wanted to be.
Including me. That's one of the early people I discovered when I started going to college.
And you find out that he started out doing comics. Umbrella Academy, which is actually a comic series.
I have all those and bunch of fables on the other side of my little bookshelf.
Drawn by Gabriel Bob, but the covers were done by James Jean here and there initially. And he had a painterly style that then translated to him doing more fine artwork, but he also did some limited edition prints, and he also did fashion, and like kind of branched out into a lot more spaces because of that. There are a lot of really good examples of people who do that, actually. Like there's an artist who I can't grasp the name of right now. He's actually more well known for his storyboarding than he is for his fine art painting. He's gotten more awards for like creating animation sequences for things like Into the Spider-Verse, or he self-taught.
Oh, are you talking about Alberto Miego?
Yeah, Alberto Miego is one that I think people know from Love, Duff, and Robots. But I think Alberto is a perfect example of someone who started to formally do commercial work when he was doing a lot more fine art, oil painting, traditional like portraiture. And then he shifted and experimented with character design and started to do walking cycles of animation. And he was approaching it like a fine artist and painting frame by frame. He was learning from animators, well, how do I translate that into something that is like a moving image? And going from that, how do I like create like a mashup of things that I want to do. Now people know him from animated shorts and Into the Spider-Verse, and he actually gets asked a lot to direct sequences versus doing the art himself necessarily for animation. So he has a lot of credits that are just purely from like a storyboarding lens rather than anything else. I think the last question I have is, posting on social media, what do you want to relate to your audience from an artistic standpoint? And where can folks check out your work, your new show?
Yeah, actually, that's actually another thing I've been thinking more about with social media. I would write a lot. I would start writing more personal stuff, like do these long posts for social media, for Instagram. And I feel like there was almost this weird freedom, well, I know a lot of people don't read them anyway. Yeah, right. So so I would just kind of be open and not really overthink it. But then the irony is that when I became a teacher, I wasn't trying to be a teacher at all. Then the head of the illustration department just reached out to me. I found out way later, a couple peers of mine that worked there recommended me, but I never had any ambitions or told anyone I wanted to be a teacher, let alone at CCS. So when he reached out to me, which is funny enough, it was on Instagram, so I thought it was a bot for a second, because I just bought this Don Kilpatrick, one of his instructional videos a week or two before. But then when he reached out, when I figured out it was real, one of the things he had reached out to me was yeah, between the work you're doing at the time and I also read all your posts and stuff, I feel like your perspective would really lend itself to being a teacher. And so I think about that too, where sometimes it's easy to think about wanting a huge audience, especially with something like social media or art shows and stuff like that. Not so much about the audience or the size of the audience, it's more more the specific person. I had one person that went through all my posts talking about some of my work, and that's helped land me my job at CCS too. So I try to find a middle ground now, where I try to write up some really personal stuff in my work, and I want people to get, since I do put a lot of time and thought into it, but also I'm doing it less and less because of just social media.
Right, yeah.
But I did launch a newsletter. I launched it last year, and that's why this year has been so interesting, because I had all these things I was going to write about, but then something would happen with the US and immigration and everything. Something would happen that would shift completely what I was writing about, and so all my little things I had planned to write about, something would happen in the world that would make me question it, or make me rewrite something different.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like it's hard to put yourself on a schedule like that until you get into a rhythm of, okay, I'm going to do this article and it's going to be what I got to post at the end of the month, or however your cadence is. In a lot of ways, if you're on social media or if you're on any sort of media, it feels like you're just in a doom scroll, and there's a level of anxiety that hasn't been there before. But there's also, I think, uniquely for people who are immigrants, a different fear of belonging and not belonging, and then being kind of told, hey, you have to prove it, in a way that feels really abrasive. I had a lot of anxieties this year as well, specifically more for my parents than me, just because I've assimilated into American culture very smoothly, and I can be more direct with people because I speak in a tone and in a method that helps me navigate other spaces. Whereas my parents are a lot more insulated with Chinese culture and Chinese identity, and they spend a lot more time at their Chinese church, and they still retain a lot of that overseas Chinese first-gen association. They keep in touch with people who came from that era and moved to the US. It's almost kind of like a weird time capsule of how they remember being Asian. Whereas if you visit some of my extended family, or you talk to people who are our age now in Asia, completely different generation, very different outlook, a lot more contemporary and fluid in ways that the things we talk about, being an artist or being creative, they're oh yeah, that's totally cool and interesting, and there is less of a survival mindset, a put your head down and go with the flow mindset, because people are finding that they can come into their own skin a bit more. Where can folks check out your new show? Plug.
Yeah, so I have an upcoming show at Detroit Shipping Company. Because of its rich history with basically a Chinatown back in the day, they're trying to bring more Asian American voices and artists into that area. And so Detroit Shipping Company has been big on trying to bring more Asian American artists in that space. So the opening will be December 14th. And work will be up for a couple months too, so a lot of people will have a chance to see it. But there's a lot of different layers to this show specifically that I wasn't expecting. that would happen for a lot of different reasons this year, even some of the stuff we're talking about just a second ago. I also have my website, stevenshik.com, that I keep pretty up to date.
Do you sell original pieces or prints or anything like that?
Kind of going through it right now. I have like prints, but they're kind of like older prints. So now I'm in the process of trying to do newer prints. But like obviously the show, everything will be sold there. And next year, I kind of definitely want to get more big on updating all my prints or even prints for some of the paintings I'm doing, or even just small stuff like maybe small risographs or screen. I really wanted to do a screen print for the show, but didn't get the chance to do it.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to move in more like print options in that nature. We kind of mentioned in passing, I have like a newsletter now. And the idea now is I'll do like smaller like written posts like on social media, but then doing like a more thorough, like more write up like through my newsletter basically. So if someone wanted more context of some of that work, they can, go over there. I actually have another show coming up in March, doing a residency in Beloit, Wisconsin, with that too. And so this show is kind of almost like a precursor to that show a little bit. I'm going to keep doing work on that, but obviously that's like in Wisconsin. I've also been in a pretty good position where group shows always pop up, where I'm always participating in a small little loose collective of other Asian American artists, where there's always some event that's going on that I usually end up participating into. So that seems to always happen every summer with that too. So yeah, and other than that, I'm just trying to become a better teacher. That's something I'm really serious about, I want to continue doing. And also just getting more shows and just thinking about those next options and steps you're talking about in terms of career goals like that too. And this definitely feels like an end cap I just turned 40, so this feels literal and figurative, one phase like ending, but I'm kind of excited to see what the next phase is now. And like I said, Detroit Shipping Company, like come out, like say hi, stuff like that. I love talking about my work and showing it off, and like I said, I'm really proud of this work, and I'm really excited to like share it in the world a little bit more.
And you can find Steven Shik at his Instagram page, Steven_Shik, SHIK, if you're interested in following him for more of his social media updates, and also through his website. So
cool.
Thank you for your time again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. This has been awesome.